If you know anything about fighting games, you'll know that they're hard. Not just in the sense that they have a high skill ceiling, but in the sense that getting into them in the first place can be a challenge because of all the shit you need to wrap your head around just to have a basic understanding of what you're doing. Stuff like neutral, frame data, okizeme, etc. Learning all this in an actual fighting game with fleshed out and in-depth mechanics can be daunting for new players, and that's where Fantasy Strike comes in. Fantasy Strike is one of the simplest fighting games ever made. Everything is purposefully dumbed down to create the most bare bones experience so that people can learn the basics of how fighting games work before they get into the real shit. There are only 3 attack buttons, plus a grab, a super, and a jump. The roster is relatively small, only around a dozen characters, and right off the bat there are some pretty good instructional videos made by the devs to teach you the basics of how to play each character. Fantasy Strike is also of significant importance to me because that's how I first started playing fighting games. And let me tell you, if Fantasy Strike can teach me, it can teach anyone. Despite this, Fantasy Strike is a little bit dead. You can still find matches, but basing your entire game off the premise that there isn't much to it makes it harder to retroactively add content because what are you going to add? It's supposed to be simple. So the lack of developer support kind of hung it up to dry. But as much as I love Fantasy Strike, there is one thing that I can't quite help but notice. A character that's been on my radar for quite some time. You see, normally Fantasy Strike is relatively balanced. There are some characters that are a little shitty, and some characters that are more overtly strong, but overall the cast is relatively balanced. Of course, with the exception of Argagard. This character truly baffles me in a way that I find hard to put into words. I don't want to spoil the rest of the video, but let me tell you that the direction they went with this character is just absolutely wild, and I honestly cannot wait to talk about it. This is Editing Charlie. Just a quick heads up that for the video going forward, sometimes I use the word opponent and the word you pretty interchangeably, so just be aware of that moving forward. Argagard is a zoner, so let's start with that. If you don't know, a zoner is a character whose gameplay revolves around keeping the opponent out. Normally this is accomplished through projectiles. A good zoner will be able to keep the attacker from approaching and will be rewarded for doing so. So, can Argagard do that? Yes. Yes, he can. So first let's go over Argagard's projectiles. And a common theme with Argagard is that the tools he has don't seem strong at first. And a good example of this is his waterfish. It's a really standard projectile. It moves linearly from one side of the screen to the other, but it doesn't do any damage. However, it does have an ungodly amount of hit stun that is possible to combo off of with its forward A. This essentially splits its main projectile into 2 parts, the projectile and the follow-up, which is really powerful because Argagard can cancel his forward A back into his B attack and essentially loop the situation over again. Alternatively, the Argagard player could follow their A attack into their C attack, which summons a river that pushes the opponent back. On top of this, it's possible to summon a fish out of the river at the opponent, which prevents them from moving forward, which gives Argagard enough time to set up their forward A attack or to use his B attack. So this is already looking solid, but what are the countermeasures for simply jumping over Argagard's projectile? Well, don't worry, because Argagard can just whack you out of the sky with his neutral A. If the opponent commits to something that makes them unwhackable, he'll just whack you when you land. He could also just anti-air you with his C attack because he can make the fish go upwards too, so even if the attacker approaches with an air attack that's immune to Argagard's neutral A and can't be punished on landing, you still need to look out for the fish. All these options combine to make a very oppressive neutral game where Argagard can bury his opponent on the ground and control vast swaths of the air. So when fighting Argagard, you have the choice of either trying to approach him and risk getting shot out of the air or just sitting there and biding your time. And trust me, you don't want to just sit there because Argagard can put pressure on you to start moving backwards. This is because he can walk with his rushing river and his waterfish and use pokes more easily because even though his forward A doesn't go quite full screen, moving him forward just a little bit can put his opponent in the danger zone, which forces them to try and move back. And he gets access to all of these options for the low commitment of just walking forwards. But none of this is even to mention the poison fish. This purple little bastard takes everything I just mentioned and puts a timer on it that says, if you don't get through this shit in 5 seconds, I will delete your health bar. How it works is the poison fish doesn't have any hit stun, but if you touch it, it makes your health go down until you take 2 damage. The effect stacks, and the only way to get rid of it is to hit Argagard. Chip damage doesn't count. And on top of all of this, Argagard still has another trick up his sleeve with his air super. This super is insane. It clears the entire screen and gives Argagard basically all the time in the world to set up whatever he wants. If the opponent is close, Argagard gets a strike through a mix-up. If the opponent gets hit by it, you can combo off of it. Argagard can even combo the super into his poison fish. So on top of having an incredibly strong win condition, he can very easily access that win condition almost whenever he has access to his super. All of this combines to make Argagard incredibly powerful. He forces the opponent to take big risks to get to him while simultaneously being able to control huge parts of the screen. He is able to keep the opponent out and he is rewarded very well for doing so. But then, most zoners are good at keeping their opponent out, and their weaknesses lie more in what happens when they get caught. Historically, zoners have been balanced out by poor defense so as to properly reward the attacking player for being able to navigate the zoner's bullshit. So while Argargar's keep away is very strong, it's still possible to overcome it with a clever use of jumping, proper use of a character's individual movement tools, and by capitalizing off of any overcommitment Argargarg makes. The problem is that when the attacking player does get into Argargarg, he has the best defense in the entire game. Right off the bat, we run into a problem with pressuring Argargarg, which is that your offense could be over before it even started. This is because of Argargarg's C attack and the fact that you can launch it not only upwards and forwards, but also backwards as well. He can even do this in block stun, and if the fish connects in any way, the attacker is back to square one. So if Argargarg pulls out the river in front of him, only approach him if you think you can punish him, because if you can't, you're going full screen. And if the attacker does manage to get close enough to Argargarg so that he can't use any of his zoning options, they still have their work cut out for themselves. And without a doubt, the number one offender for Argargarg's broken defenses is back A. It may not look like much, but this thing is busted. It has a massive disjoint and completely negates any and all jumping attempts. So whenever you're in a position close enough to Arg, he can just walk back. And if you try and approach him, he can just smack you out of the air. And if you try and approach him on the ground, guess what? He can smack you in the face. So either you let Argargarg walk away, in which case he can just keep on zoning, or you can risk approaching him, in which case you just get a slap on the cheek. You could risk trying to approach with a disjointed hitbox of your own or a move with super armor, but not all characters have access to these types of moves, and you will run into the problem of the dive kick, which cleanly beats both of these options. But let's say you've chased Argargarg into a corner. This way there really isn't anywhere for him to back up to, and you can try and pressure him to taking risks to try and escape. Well, in this case, the Argargarg player is just content to sit there and wait. Why, you might ask? That's because while you're both waiting, Argargarg is building meter, which he can then spend on his second super, the Bubble Super. This is probably the best super in the game. It has invincible startup, and when activated, it puts Argargarg in the bubble stance. This stance ends whenever Argargarg gets hit, chip damage doesn't count, and while Argargarg is in it, he can pop the bubble at any time. Popping it will make a gigantic and incredibly active hitbox around him. And here's the kicker, he can even pop it in block stun. This means that as long as Argargarg blocks anything, he gets a guaranteed punish and a one-way ticket back to neutral. The bubble shield solves another problem too, the round start situation. See, historically, zoners have struggled during round start because of how close the two fighters start next to each other. This applies to Argargarg too, but to a much less extent thanks to the aforementioned bubble shield, which effectively acts as a pause button where you can gauge what your opponent's first action will be and react accordingly. Something else worth mentioning is the grab. If you ever have the misfortune of fucking up in front of Argargarg's face, you can expect the punish to be a grab. This is because A, Argargarg doesn't really have any combos, and B, Argargarg's grab puts you in the sweet spot and gives him plenty of time to set up his zoning. This makes the pressure against him really stressful because any mistake, big or small, can potentially doom you back to the Argargarg neutral. It should be noted that everything I've mentioned so far does technically have counterplay, but compared to what Argargarg has to do, it's incredibly risky and the situation is obviously lopsided in his favor. Argargarg's defense completely breaks the balance of what zoners are supposed to be. If you're a zoner and your keep away is powerful, but your defense is also powerful, then what weaknesses do you have? It will come as no surprise to hear Argargarg has some pretty favorable matchups with the rest of the cast. He can hold his own against zoners because he flatly has more projectiles than them, and he can bop zoners trying to set up projectiles with his jump A, and in some cases just ignore projectiles entirely with his jump C, which I haven't mentioned yet. He has an ungodly strong matchup against any character that's slow because they have to struggle even harder in neutral, and most of their unique pressure tools get countered pretty hard by Argargarg's defensive options. Most other average characters also struggle pretty hard against him too, for every reason I've mentioned in this video. As far as his mirror match goes, it's incredibly slow. The game boils down to who can get the zoning started first. As far as I'm concerned, the best bet against Argargarg is the rushdown characters. They have an easier time in navigating Argargarg's zoning, and they can fight against his defense a little better too. It's far from a perfect solution, but you'll get better luck with Satsuki and Valerie than with most other characters. However, there is one unlikely hero. One character mocked for being the worst in the game. One character that could stand up to the maelstrom of nonsense that is Argargarg. Onimaru. Yeah, that's right. I'm as surprised as you are, but Onimaru really is your best bet for fighting Argargarg, which really comes as a shock considering he's commonly thought of as the worst character in the entire game, but what can I say? Here we are. So why is Onimaru such a strong matchup against Argargarg? Well, it's because of his jumping C attack, or more specifically how it has armor. You see, you can't quite anti-air it, otherwise you get counter hit, and if Onimaru whiffs it, then you also have to take a risk to punish it because you can decide to follow it up with a DP. You also can't block Onimaru forever because of his guard crush mechanic, which makes him much harder for you to deal with his pressure. But even with all of this in mind, Argagarg still has the upper hand in neutral, and because his bubble shield can cleanly counter Onimaru's pressure, the matchup is still isn't impossible for Argagarg to win. So as you would expect, overall, Argagar has mostly positive matchups with most of the cast, and the ones where he doesn't, he can still hold his own and come out on top. So yeah, Argagar's pretty good. He's really fun to play, but pretty irritating to fight. I don't think he ruins the balance of the game or anything like that. After all, the Fantasy Strike ranked format is team-based, so you need to be able to play and do well with two other characters. If I were ever to nerf Argagarg, I might make his defense weaker somehow, probably by taking away Bubble Shield's invincibility. I might also make his anti-airs a little more committal. Still though, I like Argagarg, and I don't want to see him become unviable or anything like that. That all being said, I have no idea what the Fantasy Strike devs are up to right now. I don't even know if they still intend on updating the game. The last thing they did was make Satsuki look ugly and mess around with the shaders, so yeah, who knows what they'll do next. In conclusion, fish are god tier.